Parents, was there a shocking moment that made you realize something was off with your child? Alright, folks, let me tell you about the worst day I ever had as a dad. Back in 2012, I started noticing my dog. He was 7 years old, acting real strange. Normally, he's the happiest, most lively mutt you'd ever meet, always running around, tail wagging like crazy. But out of nowhere, he turned quiet, almost like he was scared of something. He'd shy away from folks, even us, his own family. At first, I figured he was just feeling a bit off, maybe tired or sick. But after about 10 days of this, I couldn't shake the worry, so I took him to the vet to get checked out. The doc took a good look at him and came back with something I never expected. He said my dog's backside was all torn up, like someone had hurt him real bad, hurt him in a way I don't even want to say out loud. The vet was pretty sure it wasn't an accident, either. I stood there, gut churning, thinking, who in their right mind would do something so awful to a dog? I drove home, my head spinning, trying to figure it out. Our backyard's where he spent most of his time, so I started running through who could have gotten to him. It hit me that it was just me, my wife, and our teenage boy living in the house. No one else really came around. Then this sick feeling settled in my stomach, like maybe my own son could have done it. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to know. So, I went into his room, poking around, not even sure what I was looking for. Nothing jumped out at me, no obvious signs he was guilty, until I sat down at his computer and pulled up what he'd been looking at online. There it was, plain as day. He'd been on some filthy websites, the kind with pictures of people doing terrible things to animals. I nearly lost my lunch right there. It wasn't hard proof, but the more I sat with it, the more I couldn't shake the thought that my boy had done something unspeakable to our dog. Later that night, after my wife hit the hay, I walked into my son's room, sat him down, and laid it out. I said, "Hey, the dog's been acting off lately. Took him to the vet today, and turns out someone's hurt him bad, messed him up in a way that's just sick." You got any guesses how that happened? I watched him close. He fidgeted a little, but he played dumb, acting like he had no clue. So, I brought up what I'd seen on his computer, those nasty sites. He got mad fast, yelling about how I had no right to snoop. I calmed him down, told him I wasn't there to chew him out or punish him, I just needed the truth. I kept my voice steady, trying to be the dad he could talk to. After maybe 15 minutes of going back and forth, he cracked. He admitted he'd messed with the dog last week, using his hands and even a hairbrush handle. Said he didn't mean to hurt him, that he stopped when the dog yelped and bolted. He swore he didn't think it was that bad and was too ashamed to say anything. I believed he didn't mean to go that far, but when I asked why he'd even do it, he just mumbled something vague that didn't make sense. I didn't want to make a big scene, so I told him we'd keep it between us for now. But I made him promise we'd tell his mom he needed to talk to someone professional about whatever was going on in his head. I looked him dead in the eye and said he'd better never lay a hand on that dog again, or there'd be hell to pay. I found a therapist who works with teens and set up a meeting for him. I gave her a heads up about the situation, keeping it light on details so she'd have a starting point. Didn't tell my son I'd done that, figured it'd just make him clam up. Meanwhile, my dog was still down in the dumps, but I could see him perking up a little. I started taking him on longer walks, giving him extra treats and belly rubs, trying to bring him back to his old self. Bit by bit, he'd wag his tail again, and those big, happy eyes started shining through. I thought we were turning a corner until one morning, I glanced out the window and saw my son in the backyard with Colby. They were playing tug-of-war, or so I thought. Then I saw it, he was holding the dog tight, hands all over Colby's private parts, rubbing and gripping while the dog just stood there. I lost it. I charged outside, yanked him off, and lit into him. He'd sworn to me he'd never do anything like that again, and here he was, breaking that promise. I sent him to his room and locked the door behind him. My wife was still at her job, and I was pacing the house, feeling like I'd hit rock bottom. That therapy? Clearly, it wasn't doing a damn thing. When my wife got home that evening, I couldn't keep it in anymore. I sat her down and told her why I'd pushed for our son to see someone. Said he'd begged me not to tell her, and I'd agreed, thinking he'd stick to his word and leave the dog alone. She stared at me, stunned, then I told her what I'd just caught him doing in the yard. She went from mad to bawling in about 2 seconds flat. Said she felt like I'd stabbed her in the back, threw some ugly names my way, then grabbed her purse and stormed out. I didn't know where she was headed, and I didn't chase her. I was too busy feeling like the world's sorriest husband and father. Later, I went to my son's room to talk. He was ticked I'd spilled everything to his mom, but after a short chat, I figured he got why I had to. A bit later, my wife called from her sister's place. Said she was crashing there to cool off. She sounded less fired up but told me she couldn't deal with this mess tonight. I said I got it, said sorry over and over for keeping her in the dark. When we hung up, I told her I loved her, but she didn't say it back, just clicked off. She stayed at her sister's for a few days, then came home. That's when the real fight started. We went at it for a week straight about our boy and what to do with him. She kept saying I was the jerk for not looping her in sooner. I told her we ought to find Colby a new home, he wasn't safe with us anymore. She hated that idea. Then, after more shouting, she dropped a bomb. She'd talked to our son, and he swore up and down he'd never touched the dog. Now she was mad at me, saying she didn't know who to believe. In one blowout, she even hinted maybe I was the one who'd hurt Colby. That set me off. I was seeing red. Long story short, we didn't fix a thing. The arguing just got worse, and with other stuff piling up between us, she finally said she wanted a break, a trial separation. Our son picked her side, so I packed up and moved to a buddy's place, trying to figure out my next step. I wanted to take Colby with me, but that just sparked more nasty digs from her, so he stayed behind. I tried talking to my son, asking why he was lying about what he'd done, but he shut me out, called me nuts. Guess he figured he could pin it all on me and wiggle free. That hurt worse than anything, my own kid turning on me when I was just trying to help him. Still, I told myself he was young, stuck in a bad spot, and I didn't want to hate him for it. If me and my wife split for good, he'd be all I had left, so I didn't want to burn that bridge. But man, I'd already messed up our family enough. I'd love to say I was still focused on keeping Colby safe, but truth is, I wasn't. My home life was falling apart, and I was desperate to patch it up, get things back to normal. I kept calling my son, hoping he'd fess up and we could start fixing this mess together. He never answered, never called back. So, one day, I showed up at the house when I knew they'd be there. Banged on the door, but my wife wouldn't open it. I'll admit, I lost my cool, started yelling and hammering harder. She came out, and we had it out right there in the front yard. She ended up covering her ears, screaming dog abuser loud enough for the whole street to hear, trying to shame me. I stormed off to my car, mad as hell, and glanced back. There was my son, staring down from his window, face blank as a wall. I shook my head at him, disappointed, but he didn't flinch. That tore me up inside and left me steaming. Time jumped forward, and I was at work one day when my phone buzzed. It was my wife, crying her eyes out. Said Colby had bitten our son, bit him twice in the gut, and he was at the hospital getting stitched up. She didn't know what to make of it, but I did. I knew she'd finally seen the truth. Colby's a good dog, never snapped at anyone without a reason. I hung up, anger boiling up inside me. This had to stop. Colby had fought back against my son, who turned his back on us both. I couldn't prove it, but I was dead sure my boy was at it again, and Colby'd had enough. I felt like garbage for leaving him there with a kid who didn't give a damn about anyone but himself. I left work right then and drove to the house. My wife let me in this time. I marched up to my son's room. He was lying there, watching TV, and looked shocked to see me. I cut him off before he could speak. Said, "I know what you've been doing. Lie all you want, blame me, but we both know the truth. I'm taking the dog. You ever touch an animal like this again, I'm calling the cops. I don't care if you're my son. This is wrong, and I didn't raise you to be this way." Then I went out back, clipped a leash on Colby, and walked him through the house. My wife stopped me at the door, tears in her eyes, saying she was sorry. We talked for a few minutes, both choking up. She asked me to forgive her, and I said I did. She offered to let me stay, but I told her no, Colby deserved better than this, and I'd already failed him too much. I left her there, sobbing, and took Colby to my car. We headed back to my friend's place. He was safe now, but I knew crashing there with a dog was asking a lot from my pal. Still, it's what I had to do. Years later, by 2018, me and my ex never patched things up. Life got better, though. Colby passed away the year before old age took him, nothing bad. Me and my son went years without talking, but we're on better terms now than back in 2012. We don't bring up what happened. I pray he's past that twisted stuff. If he ain't, I wouldn't know he's out on his own now. My ex-wife? She hit a rough patch, lost her job, started seeing a shrink. We barely talk, and word is she's mixed up in some bad habits, drugs, maybe worse. I don't dig into it, mostly for my son's sake. Me, I've got a new lady in my life these past few years, and things are good. We got a new pup after Colby, and he's already my best buddy.